The Riverside Motel sign flickered in the late afternoon sun when I pulled into the parking lot looking for the craft store my sister had recommended, the one she'd sworn was just past the interstate exit on Route 42. Except there was no craft store, just this aging motel with its faded blue doors and cars parked at irregular intervals, and I was about to turn around when I saw my husband Richard's silver Lexus in space 17. The license plate was unmistakable, Rich 47, the vanity plate he'd gotten for his 47th birthday that I'd always thought was tacky, but he'd loved. He was supposed to be at the dental conference in Chicago, the 3-day event he'd mentioned casually over breakfast 4 days ago while reading the paper. But his car was here, parked outside a motel room at 3:15 p.m. on a Tuesday in May, and standing at the door with him, laughing at something he'd said, touching his arm in a way that made my stomach drop, was my daughter-in-law Jessica, my son, Marcus's wife, the woman who called me mom and brought wine to Sunday dinners and had been part of our family for 6 years. I sat frozen in my car for exactly 90 seconds, watching them disappear into room 17, and then I backed out slowly and drove home in silence. If you've ever discovered a betrayal and had to decide whether to confront it immediately or wait, subscribe, and tell me what state you're in, because what I decided in that parking lot would define the next 6 months of my life. The drive home took 23 minutes, and I spent every one of them in a strange calm that felt like shock wrapped in ice, my hands steady on the wheel while my brain tried to process what I'd just witnessed. Richard and Jessica, my husband of 32 years, and my son's wife, together at a motel on a Tuesday afternoon when both of them had supposedly been elsewhere, him at his conference, her at the teaching seminar she'd mentioned to Marcus over the weekend. The logistics of their deception suggested planning, coordination, a level of betrayal that went beyond impulse or accident into something calculated and ongoing. How long had this been happening? Months? Years? Had they been laughing at me over Sunday dinners? Had they been careful about not standing too close or making eye contact across the table? Had they developed signals and codes that the rest of us were too trusting to notice? The questions spiraled endlessly, but beneath them was a deeper question that would shape everything that followed. What was I going to do about it? Confrontation was the obvious choice. Storm back to that motel, pound on room 17's door, demand explanations and accountability, and immediate cessation of whatever this was. But something stopped me from turning around. Some instinct that said confrontation would give them control of the narrative, would let them spin stories about loneliness, or misunderstanding, or temporary madness. So I drove home, parked in my usual spot, and walked into the house that Richard and I had lived in for 26 years, knowing everything had changed, but nothing looked different yet. The kitchen still smelled like the lemon cleaning spray I'd used that morning, and the breakfast dishes Richard had promised to wash before leaving for his conference sat untouched in the sink exactly as I'd known they would be. I stood at the counter for a long moment, staring at his coffee mug with its faded "World's Best Dentist" print, and felt something harden inside me like concrete setting into permanent form. Confronting him now would be satisfying but strategically stupid. He'd deny, she'd deny, they'd coordinate their stories and probably continue more carefully with better operational security. But if I stayed silent, if I pretended I'd seen nothing, if I acted normal while gathering evidence and planning my response, I'd maintain control of when and how this secret was revealed. The decision crystallized in that moment, standing at my sink. I would say nothing. Not to Richard, not to Jessica, not to Marcus, who deserved to know his wife was cheating on him with his father, but whose knowledge would complicate everything. Not to my sister Eleanor, who'd want immediate confrontation. Not to my friend Margaret, who'd want me to hire a private investigator. Not to anyone who might tip them off that I knew. For the next however many weeks or months, I would play the role of oblivious wife while documenting everything, because I'd learned from 32 years of marriage that Richard was meticulous about record-keeping. If this affair had been happening for a while, there would be evidence, financial transactions, schedule patterns, maybe even communications if I knew where to look. And when I had everything I needed, when the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, then I'd act. But on my timeline, not theirs. Richard came home at 6:40 p.m. that evening, carrying his overnight bag and wearing the slightly rumpled look of someone who'd been traveling, which was an impressive commitment to the lie given that he'd actually been at a motel 20 minutes away. "How was Chicago?" I asked from the kitchen where I was preparing dinner, my voice steady and interested in the way that 32 years of wifehood had taught me to sound. "Exhausting," he replied, kissing my cheek with the casual affection of long marriage that now felt like acid on my skin. The keynote speaker went 2 hours over, and the hotel restaurant gave me food poisoning. "I'm just glad to be home." The lies flowed smoothly, each one layered with just enough detail to sound authentic, but not so much that I'd remember specifics to question later. He asked about my day, and I told him about the errands I'd run, omitting the Riverside Motel naturally, and we settled into dinner conversation that felt surreal in its normalcy. Across the table, Richard ate the pot roast I'd made and talked about dental conferences I knew he hadn't attended, and I smiled and nodded and asked follow-up questions while mentally cataloging every tell, every hesitation, every micro-expression that might indicate guilt or concern that I suspected something. But he seemed relaxed, confident, like a man who'd successfully maintained his double life for however long this had been going on. The wedding photo on the wall behind him showed us at 23 and 25, impossibly young and genuinely happy, and I wondered when exactly that happiness had curdled into whatever this was. Wednesday morning, I started my investigation with the methodical approach I'd learned from 3 decades of managing our household finances, while Richard focused on his dental practice. Our bank accounts were joint, which meant I had access to every transaction he'd made in the past year, and I spent 3 hours that afternoon going through statements, line by line, looking for patterns or anomalies that might confirm what I'd witnessed. There were dozens of small cash withdrawals from ATMs near his office, $50 or $80 at a time, amounts small enough not to trigger attention, but that added up to thousands over 12 months. Restaurant charges at places we'd never eaten together appeared regularly on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the same days Richard claimed late evening appointments or dental society meetings. A hotel charge from 3 months ago in a city where he'd supposedly attended a weekend conference, except the amount was for 2 nights when he'd only been gone 1. The evidence wasn't conclusive. He could argue all of it was legitimate, but the pattern was damning when combined with what I'd seen at the Riverside Motel. I created a spreadsheet documenting each suspicious transaction with date, amount, and location, building a financial trail that matched what I now suspected was an affair that had been ongoing for at least a year, possibly longer. The spreadsheet would eventually contain 347 entries, each one a small betrayal that added up to systematic deception. But I saved it under an innocuous file name, Grocery Budget Planning, that Richard would never think to open, and I backed it up to a cloud account he didn't know existed. Evidence was only valuable if it remained hidden until the moment I chose to reveal it. Thursday brought Marcus and Jessica to our house for our usual weekly dinner, and I watched my daughter-in-law move through my kitchen with the easy familiarity of 6 years of family meals while knowing she'd been in a motel room with my husband 3 days ago. Jessica was 29, pretty in a conventional way, with blonde hair she wore in a ponytail and a teaching job at the elementary school that she genuinely seemed to love. Marcus, 31, worked in tech sales and adored her with the uncomplicated devotion of someone who'd never imagined his wife might betray him with his own father. They'd been trying to get pregnant for 2 years, a process Jessica discussed openly with me over wine and commiseration about fertility challenges, and I'd been sympathetic and supportive because that's what mothers-in-law did. Except now every conversation we'd ever had felt contaminated by her secret. Every confidence she'd shared revealed as manipulation or compartmentalization, or possibly just the ability to lie so comprehensively that she could discuss her marriage troubles with her lover's wife without visible guilt. She helped me set the table while Richard and Marcus talked about the upcoming baseball season in the living room, and she complained about a difficult parent conference she'd had that week, and I made sympathetic noises while mentally adding her to my spreadsheet of evidence that would eventually destroy our family, but hopefully deliver some form of justice. "You're quiet tonight, Mom," Marcus said halfway through dinner, and I realized I'd been watching Jessica and Richard too carefully, looking for glances or signals or anything that would confirm they were maintaining their affair even here at my table. "Just tired," I replied, smiling at my son, who had no idea his wife and father were betraying him in ways I couldn't yet tell him about. "It's been a long week." We finished dinner, they left around 9 p.m., and I stood at the sink washing dishes while Richard read in his study, both of us playing our roles in a marriage that was already over, even if he didn't know it yet. Friday afternoon, I finally told someone, choosing my sister Eleanor, because she was the only person I trusted to keep the secret until I decided to reveal it publicly. We met at the coffee shop near her condo, the one with the uncomfortable modern furniture and overpriced lattes, and I told her everything in a whisper that didn't carry beyond our corner table. "Richard and Jessica," she repeated, her face cycling through shock and disgust and fury. "Your husband and Marcus's wife. Are you absolutely certain?" I showed her the photo I'd taken on my phone from my car in the motel parking lot, a shot of Richard's license plate and Jessica's car parked 3 spaces down that clearly established both of them were there at the same time. "Jesus, Helen, what are you going to do?" Eleanor had been divorced twice and had strong opinions about male betrayal that generally involved immediate exposure and financial revenge. But I'd already decided on a different approach. "I'm going to document everything until I have proof so overwhelming that neither of them can deny it or minimize it or blame it on me somehow. And then I'm going to tell Marcus, and we're going to handle it together." Eleanor studied me for a long moment, probably seeing something in my face that looked different from the sister she'd known for 64 years. "You're not going to forgive him." It wasn't a question. "No," I agreed. "I'm not. But I'm also not going to confront him until I'm ready, until I have everything in place to protect myself financially and emotionally and legally. Richard has always been better at strategy than I am, better at planning and execution and getting what he wants. But this time I'm going to be better, because he doesn't know I know, and that's an advantage I'm not giving up until I'm ready to use it." Eleanor nodded slowly, then reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "I'm here for whatever you need. Evidence gathering, emotional support, bail money if you decide to murder him." We both smiled, but mine felt brittle and cold. Murder wasn't necessary when systematic exposure would be so much more satisfying. The symbolic object that would eventually tie everything together appeared in week 3 of my silent investigation. A small detail I almost missed, but that would become critically important later. Richard had a will, updated 5 years ago when we'd done estate planning with Attorney Morrison from the downtown firm Eleanor had recommended. The will was standard. Everything to me if he died first, then to Marcus and our daughter Sarah, with specific bequests to charities and provisions for grandchildren we didn't have yet. But Richard had also told me about a separate letter he'd written to be read at his funeral, something he'd mentioned casually one evening over dinner about a year ago. "Just thoughts on life and love," he'd said. "Things I'd want people to know about what mattered to me." He'd shown me where he kept it, in his study desk, bottom drawer, in a manila envelope labeled "Final Letter." At the time, it had seemed sweet, if slightly morbid, Richard being thoughtful about his legacy. Now it seemed ominous, a potential confession or justification or final statement that might reference Jessica, might reveal how long the affair had been ongoing, might contain information I could use. But I couldn't read it now. He'd notice if the envelope was disturbed. So I made a mental note of its existence and moved on to more accessible evidence. The letter would wait in that drawer, a loaded weapon I didn't yet know how to fire, while I built my case through bank statements and credit card charges and the slow accumulation of proof that would make confrontation undeniable. Richard's final letter would become important, but not until much later. Not until after everything had been irreversibly revealed and the damage had been fully assessed. For now, it was just another piece of a puzzle I was slowly assembling while pretending I didn't know there was a puzzle at all. Memorial Day weekend arrived at the end of May with all the usual family obligations. A cookout at our house with Marcus and Jessica, Sarah and her husband Tom, Eleanor and her current boyfriend whose name I could never remember, and assorted neighbors who'd been coming to our annual barbecue for 15 years. I spent Saturday preparing food and setting up the backyard while Richard cleaned the grill and arranged chairs and performed all the hosting duties of a man who wasn't currently having an affair with his daughter-in-law. Jessica arrived early to help, wearing a sundress that Richard complimented. "You look nice, Jess." and I watched for any sign that the compliment was more than casual politeness. But they were careful, maintaining appropriate distance, never making eye contact longer than normal conversation required. They'd probably been doing this for months, perfecting the art of appearing platonic while conducting their affair with timing and locations that minimized risk of discovery. Except they'd gotten sloppy that Tuesday at the Riverside Motel. Or maybe they'd been meeting there for months and I'd simply never driven past at the right time before. Either way, the secret was harder to maintain at a family gathering where everyone was watching everyone else, where Jessica had to be Marcus's attentive wife and I had to be the gracious mother-in-law while Richard played host. "You're doing great," Eleanor whispered to me at one point, having watched me maintain my performance for 3 hours without breaking character. I'd have stabbed him with the barbecue fork by now. The image made me smile genuinely for the first time in weeks, and I held onto that spark of humor like a lifeline while cutting watermelon for guests who had no idea they were attending a cookout that was really a wake for a marriage already dead. June brought summer heat and the continued pretense of normalcy, with Richard maintaining his schedule of Tuesday and Thursday, late nights, and occasional weekend conferences that I now understood were affair maintenance rather than professional obligations. I'd started following him twice, carefully and from a distance, confirming that the late nights involved meeting Jessica at various locations, once at a restaurant 2 towns over, once at what appeared to be her friend's empty condo based on the fact that they entered together and the lights came on in a second-floor unit. The evidence was accumulating, but so was my exhaustion from maintaining the pretense. Every morning I woke up next to a man who was betraying me, made his coffee, asked about his day, performed the 1,000 small intimacies of long marriage while knowing it was all theater. He'd kiss me goodbye before leaving for work, and I'd taste the lie on his lips. He'd ask what I wanted for dinner, and I'd suggest something while mentally adding that conversation to the tally of deceptions we were both performing. Him pretending to be faithful, me pretending to be oblivious. The strain was enormous, and twice I'd almost broken character, almost thrown the evidence in his face, and demanded explanations. But each time I'd stopped myself by remembering that confrontation on my timeline was strategy. Confrontation on his timeline was reaction. I needed to wait until I had everything documented, until I'd decided exactly how I wanted to handle not just Richard, but Jessica. Not just the end of my marriage, but the destruction of Marcus's. This wasn't just about my betrayal. It was about protecting my son from a wife who'd proven herself capable of stunning disloyalty. And that protection required patience I didn't naturally possess, but was learning to develop through sheer force of will. The midpoint of my 6-month performance arrived in late July, when I shifted from passive documentation to active planning, moving from reactive evidence gathering to proactive preparation for the confrontation I knew was inevitable. I'd spent 3 months building a case, compiling bank statements and credit card receipts and timeline spreadsheets and photographs taken from my car during following sessions that I'd told myself were strategic reconnaissance, but that sometimes felt like self-harm. The evidence filled a folder 3 inches thick, meticulously organized with tabs and highlights and notes that would make Richard's denial impossible. But evidence alone wasn't enough. I needed a plan for what came after revelation, needed to understand the legal and financial and emotional implications of ending a 32-year marriage to a man who'd betrayed me with my daughter-in-law. So I'd scheduled a consultation with Attorney Morrison, telling Richard I was meeting Eleanor for lunch when I was actually discussing divorce procedures and asset division and the relative merits of filing immediately versus waiting for more evidence. Michigan is a no-fault divorce state, which means the affair doesn't technically matter for the legal proceedings, Attorney Morrison had explained, his 60-something face kind but pragmatic. But it matters for negotiation and settlement, and making sure you're protected from any claims that you were somehow at fault or unreasonable. What you've documented here, he gestured at my folder. This is thorough enough that we could file tomorrow if you wanted. But you're asking about waiting, about timing the revelation strategically. Tell me why. I'd explained about Marcus, about wanting to tell my son before filing so he wasn't blindsided by his father's lawyers, about needing time to prepare emotionally for the public exposure that divorce would bring. Attorney Morrison had nodded, understanding that sometimes legal strategy had to accommodate human psychology. Then wait, he'd advised, but not too long. The longer you maintain this pretense, the more it will cost you mentally and emotionally. Set a deadline. 3 months, 6 months, whatever feels right, and then act on that deadline regardless of whether you feel ready. Because you'll never feel fully ready to blow up your life, even when blowing it up is the right thing to do. August arrived with oppressive humidity and the growing sense that I couldn't maintain my performance much longer, that the weight of knowing Richard's betrayal while pretending ignorance was crushing something essential inside me that might not recover if I waited too much longer. I'd set my deadline per Attorney Morrison's advice, November 1st, exactly 6 months from the day I'd seen Richard and Jessica at the Riverside Motel. 6 months felt like enough time to gather every piece of evidence, to prepare Marcus emotionally for what I'd have to tell him, to get my own finances separated and protected, and to steel myself for the social fallout that would come from exposing not just an affair, but an affair between my husband and my daughter-in-law that would scandalize our entire social circle. But August brought an unexpected complication in the form of Richard's declining health, chest pains that he initially dismissed as heartburn, but that I insisted he get checked after the 3rd episode in 2 weeks. "It's probably nothing," he'd said, wincing as another pain hit during breakfast on August 15th. "Just stress from work." But I'd called our doctor anyway, had made him an appointment for that afternoon, had driven him to the clinic where they'd done an EKG and blood work, and sent him immediately to the hospital for further testing. The diagnosis came 2 days later. Severe coronary artery disease, 3 vessels significantly blocked, requiring immediate bypass surgery that was scheduled for August 29th. "Your husband was a heart attack waiting to happen," the cardiologist told me, with the blunt honesty that doctors develop when they've delivered too much bad news. "If you hadn't insisted he come in, he'd probably have had a major cardiac event within weeks, possibly fatal. The surgery is serious, but his prognosis is good if we address it now." I'd listened to this information while holding Richard's hand in the hospital room, performing the concerned wife while internally wrestling with the fact that the man whose betrayal I'd been documenting for 3 months now needed major surgery that I could have prevented by maintaining my ignorance. The universe had terrible timing. The surgery was successful in the medical sense. 4 bypasses completed without complications, recovery proceeding normally. But it complicated my timeline in ways I hadn't anticipated. Richard came home from the hospital on September 6th, weak and dependent in ways he'd never been before, needing help with basic tasks like dressing and bathing and walking upstairs. The affair with Jessica had apparently been suspended during his hospitalization and recovery, or at least I'd seen no evidence of communication between them, no suspicious phone calls or visits. Marcus came by daily to check on his father, and Jessica accompanied him sometimes, playing the dutiful daughter-in-law while I played the devoted wife, both of us pretending we weren't thinking about the same man in very different contexts. "Thank you for taking care of him," Marcus said to me one evening while Richard slept upstairs. "I know it's not easy, dealing with all this medical stuff, but Dad's lucky to have you." The irony was staggering. My son praising me for caring for the man who'd been sleeping with his wife, while that wife sat in my living room drinking tea and asking if there was anything she could do to help. I wanted to scream at both of them, wanted to break my silence and expose everything right there, wanted to stop pretending for even one moment that everything was fine. But Richard was genuinely fragile now, recovering from major surgery, and confronting him while he was physically vulnerable felt like attacking someone who couldn't defend himself. So I maintained my performance, helped him recover, managed his medications and doctor appointments and physical therapy sessions, and pushed my November 1st deadline further into the future because I'd apparently developed ethics about kicking people when they were down, even when they deserved it. October brought Richard's return to work on a modified schedule and the apparent resumption of his affair, based on the Tuesday and Thursday late nights that reappeared on his calendar and the credit card charges at restaurants that looked suspiciously like the pattern from before his surgery. He was healthy enough now to betray me again, which meant I was free to resume my documentation without guilt about his physical fragility. The folder of evidence had grown to 5 inches thick, a comprehensive record of financial deception spanning 14 months, and I'd added medical information from his surgery that might become relevant in divorce proceedings. Specifically that I'd likely saved his life by insisting on that doctor's appointment in August, which gave me significant moral leverage even if it didn't matter legally. My new deadline was November 30th, Thanksgiving weekend, having passed with another performance of family unity that had left me exhausted and brittle. But November brought a development none of us had anticipated. Richard had a massive heart attack on November 27th while at his dental practice, coding twice in the ambulance and dying in the emergency room despite 40 minutes of resuscitation attempts. The call came from his office manager at 2:35 p.m. while I was folding laundry, and I'd driven to the hospital in a state of shock that wasn't about grief, but about the fact that death had robbed me of the confrontation I'd been planning for 6 months. Richard was gone before I could tell him I knew about Jessica. Gone before I could see his face when I revealed all the evidence. Gone before I could demand explanations or apologies or acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. The betrayal would never be addressed. The affair would never be exposed, and I'd spent 6 months gathering evidence for a reckoning that would now never happen. Or so I thought, standing in that emergency room being told my husband of 32 years was dead. But I'd forgotten about the letter in Richard's desk, the final statement he'd written for his funeral, and that letter was about to give me the confrontation I'd been denied. The funeral was scheduled for December 2nd at Morrison Funeral Home, a venue that could accommodate the 200 people expected to attend for a man who'd been prominent in our community for 3 decades. I'd spent the 4 days between Richard's death and his funeral making arrangements while Marcus and Sarah helped with logistics, and Jessica played the grieving daughter-in-law who'd apparently had the emotional flexibility to mourn the man she'd been sleeping with while comforting his widow, who was me. The performance would have been impressive if it wasn't so revolting, watching Jessica cry at the viewing and hug me and tell me how sorry she was for my loss when she'd been part of that loss in ways no one else in the room understood. But I'd maintained my silence through it all, had accepted condolences and coordinated flowers, and written an obituary that praised Richard's dedication to his family and community without mentioning that he'd been dedicated enough to his daughter-in-law to risk destroying his son's marriage. The one thing I'd insisted on was that Richard's final letter be read at the funeral, the letter he'd written and stored in his desk with instructions that it be shared at his service. Marcus had retrieved it from Richard's study the day after his death, had handed me the manila envelope with final letter, written in Richard's careful handwriting, and had asked if I wanted to read it privately first. No, I'd said, making a decision that felt both reckless and necessary. Your father wanted it read at his funeral. We should respect that wish. Marcus had seemed surprised by my certainty but hadn't argued, probably attributing it to grief or shock or my need to honor Richard's memory. But I had different motivations for insisting that letter be read aloud to 200 people. Suspicions about what it might contain that would finally give me the public revelation I'd been denied by Richard's inconvenient death. I'd spent 6 months gathering evidence for a confrontation that never happened. But maybe Richard had written his own confrontation, had confessed in his final letter what he'd been too cowardly to admit while alive. And if he had, then his funeral would become something very different from a simple memorial service. The morning of December 2nd arrived cold and clear, the kind of winter day that made everything look sharp-edged and unforgiving, which felt appropriate for what I suspected was coming. I dressed carefully in a black suit Richard had always liked, styled my hair the way he'd preferred, performed the widow role one last time before potentially destroying it with whatever that letter contained. Eleanor came over to drive with me, having spent the last 4 days as my constant companion and moral support, now that she knew about the affair and was waiting to see how I'd handle the public revelation that Richard's death had complicated. Are you sure about this? She asked as we drove to the funeral home. Reading his letter without knowing what it says? He could have written anything, could be completely innocuous. But I had a feeling it wouldn't be innocuous, had a sense that Richard's need for documentation that matched my own meant he'd written something honest in that letter. Something that would finally validate the 6 months I'd spent performing ignorance while gathering evidence that was now mostly useless, because you can't divorce a dead man. I'm sure, I told Eleanor. Whatever that letter says, people need to hear it. He wanted it read at his funeral. I'm just honoring his wishes. We arrived at the funeral home at 9:45 for the 10 a.m. service, and I greeted mourners with the dignity expected of a widow while searching the crowd for Jessica and Marcus. They arrived at 9:58, Marcus looking exhausted and devastated, Jessica looking appropriately somber in a black dress that was respectful enough for a funeral but stylish enough that Richard probably would have appreciated it. The thought made me sick, and I turned away to greet Richard's brother and sister who'd flown in from California and whose sympathy felt genuine because they didn't know what I knew. By 10:15, everyone was seated in the chapel, and the service began with hymns and psalms and a eulogy from Richard's dental partner that praised his professional skill and personal integrity. Soon, it would be time for Richard's letter, and everything would either be revealed or remain forever hidden. I'd spent 6 months controlling the narrative of my silence. Now I was about to give Richard the final word, not knowing if that word would vindicate me or protect him. But either way, the performance was ending. The funeral director, Mr. Peterson, approached the podium at 10:42, holding the manila envelope I'd given him before the service, with instructions that its contents be read aloud, as Richard had requested. Richard Morrison left a letter to be shared at his memorial, Mr. Peterson announced, his professional voice carrying clearly through the chapel's sound system. He wrote this approximately a year ago as a final message to his family and friends about what mattered most to him. The room settled into attentive silence, 200 people waiting to hear Richard's last words, and I felt my heart hammering in my chest with anticipation and terror in equal measure. Mr. Peterson opened the envelope, removed 3 sheets of paper covered in Richard's neat handwriting, and began to read. "To my family, my friends, and everyone who has been part of my life," he started, Richard's words sounding strange in Mr. Peterson's voice. "If you're hearing this, I'm gone. I wanted to leave some final thoughts about love and regret, and the mistakes I've made that I hope you can learn from." The chapel was completely silent, except for Mr. Peterson's voice, and I watched Jessica from across the room, saw her stiffen slightly as the letter continued. "I've had what many people would call a good life, successful career, loving family, financial security, the respect of my community, but I've also made choices I'm deeply ashamed of. Choices that betrayed the people who trusted me most." Mr. Peterson's voice caught slightly, probably realizing where this was going before most of the mourners did. "Specifically, I had an affair that lasted 15 months with someone who should have been off limits in every possible way. I'm not naming names because protecting their privacy is the least I can do after using them so selfishly. But they know who they are, and more importantly, my wife knows." The chapel erupted in whispers that Mr. Peterson tried to speak over, his professional composure cracking as he realized he was reading a confession rather than a eulogy. "Helen, I know you knew," Richard's letter continued, his words cutting through the chaos like a knife. "I saw it in your eyes that day in July when I came home from the supposed Chicago conference. I saw the way you looked at me differently, like you were seeing me clearly for the first time. I don't know how you found out. Maybe you followed me. Maybe someone told you. Maybe you just figured it out from all the obvious signs I was careless about hiding. But you knew, and instead of confronting me, you stayed silent. You pretended everything was normal for months while I continued my betrayal, and that silence was more devastating than any accusation could have been. It meant you were done with me but loved me enough, or hated me enough, or was strategic enough to wait for the right moment to reveal what you knew." The confession was meticulously detailed, acknowledging dates and locations and his own responsibility, and I watched Jessica turn white while Marcus turned to stare at her with dawning horror. "I was a coward," Richard's letter admitted through Mr. Peterson's increasingly uncomfortable voice. "I should have ended my marriage honestly if I was unhappy instead of seeking comfort elsewhere. I should have respected the sacred trust that family represents. I should have been honest with everyone I was hurting, instead of assuming I could manage multiple deceptions indefinitely. But I didn't. And now I'm asking my wife for forgiveness I don't deserve, and probably won't receive. Helen, you deserve so much better than what I gave you. I'm sorry that my final gift is this public confession, but I wanted everyone to know that you were the faithful one, the strong one, the one who maintained her dignity while I destroyed mine. Whatever you decide to do with this information after I'm gone, you have my full support and my deepest apologies." The letter ended with generic words about cherishing life and appreciating loved ones, but no one was listening anymore. The damage was done. The chaos that followed Richard's confession was immediate and comprehensive. 200 people processing the revelation that the man they'd come to mourn had publicly admitted to betraying his wife with someone in the family, and the collective suspicion immediately turned to Jessica, based on the way she'd gone pale and the way Marcus was now standing and backing away from her like she'd become toxic. "Marcus, it's not... I can explain," Jessica started, but her denial was drowned out by Marcus's voice, loud enough to carry across the chapel. "Were you sleeping with my father?" The question was brutal in its directness, and Jessica's face confirmed the truth before her mouth could form another lie. "Marcus, please, can we talk about this privately?" But Marcus was already walking out, shoving through mourners who parted to let him pass, and I watched my daughter-in-law stand alone in the aisle while whispers turned to open staring and judgment. Eleanor grabbed my hand, squeezing hard enough to hurt, and I realized I was smiling. Not a pleasant smile, but something cold and satisfied. The smile of someone who'd waited 6 months for vindication and was finally receiving it. Richard had given me the confrontation I'd been denied by his death, had exposed the affair, and specifically acknowledged that I'd known and stayed silent, had validated my strategy and given me the moral high ground in a way that no private confrontation could have achieved. "Helen, did you know what was in that letter?" someone asked. "Richard's sister, I think." But I just shook my head and continued smiling that terrible smile. "Richard wanted it read at his funeral," I said, my voice carrying a satisfaction I didn't bother to hide. I just honored his wishes. The funeral dissolved after that, people leaving in clusters while Jessica fled through a side door and Marcus disappeared into the parking lot. The memorial service for Richard Morrison had become instead the exposure of his betrayal and the beginning of his legacy as the man who destroyed his own family. And I'd orchestrated it all by doing nothing except letting Richard's own words condemn him. The immediate aftermath of the funeral brought a cascade of consequences that I'd anticipated intellectually, but wasn't fully prepared for emotionally, starting with Marcus appearing at my door at 7 p.m. that evening, with eyes red from crying and questions I'd been expecting for 6 months. "You knew," he said, not quite an accusation, but close. "Dad's letter said you knew. For how long?" I let him inside, made tea I didn't drink, and told him everything. The Riverside Motel, the months of documentation, the decision to stay silent while gathering evidence, the surgery that had complicated my timeline, and the death that had robbed me of the confrontation I'd been planning. Marcus listened without interrupting, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't identify, and when I finished, he sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. "Why didn't you tell me? All those months, all those dinners where I brought Jessica to your house, you knew and you said nothing. Why?" The hurt in his voice was real and justified, and I'd struggled with this exact question for 6 months. "Because telling you would have meant confronting them both immediately, and I wasn't ready for that confrontation. I needed time to document everything, to prepare legally and financially and emotionally for what came next. I know that sounds calculated and cold, but Marcus, your father was better at strategic planning than I was. If I'd confronted him without overwhelming evidence, he'd have denied everything, and you'd have been caught choosing between believing your father or believing me. This way, with 6 months of documentation plus his own written confession, there's no ambiguity about what happened or who was responsible." Marcus nodded slowly, processing this with the analytical mind he'd inherited from Richard, seeing the strategy even as he mourned the necessity of it. "And Jessica? What am I supposed to do about her?" The question hung between us, and I had no good answer because I'd spent 6 months planning Richard's exposure but not thinking through the ripples it would create in Marcus's marriage. "That's your decision, not mine. But I'll tell you what I learned from staying silent for 6 months. Betrayal this comprehensive doesn't happen impulsively. This was planned, coordinated, sustained over 15 months according to your father's letter. Jessica made choices every single day to continue deceiving you, just like Richard made choices to continue deceiving me. Whether you can forgive that or move past it or rebuild trust after it, that's something only you can determine." Marcus left around 10 p.m., and I stood at my window watching his taillights disappear down the street, wondering if I'd just helped destroy my son's marriage by exposing my own. But the alternative had been letting Jessica continue her deception indefinitely, and that felt like a different kind of betrayal. me protecting Jessica at Marcus's expense because revealing the truth was uncomfortable. Richard had made his choices, Jessica had made hers, and I'd made mine by staying silent until Richard's own words could do the exposing. Now, we all had to live with the consequences, whatever those turned out to be. The financial aftermath of Richard's death proved as complicated as the emotional aftermath, involving lawyers and accountants and insurance companies that all needed documentation I'd been collecting for 6 months before his death, made it relevant in unexpected ways. Richard's will left everything to me as his surviving spouse, which meant I inherited the dental practice, the house, his retirement accounts, his life insurance policy for $350,000, and all the debt he'd apparently accumulated during his affair that I documented in my spreadsheet but hadn't fully appreciated until now. The credit card statements showed $12,000 charged to secret restaurant meals, hotel rooms, and gifts I'd never received, presumably given to Jessica. There were cash withdrawals totaling another $18,000 spread across 14 months, money that had disappeared into the affair's operational costs. So Richard had spent roughly $30,000 betraying me, funds that came from our joint accounts without my knowledge or consent, and that now I'd have to absorb as his widow. Attorney Morrison helped me navigate the legal complexities of Richard's estate, and when I showed him the evidence I'd gathered during my 6 months of silent documentation, his face had gone carefully neutral. "This is extremely thorough," he'd said, looking at my spreadsheets and photographs and timeline. "Were you planning to file for divorce before his death?" I'd confirmed that yes, I'd had an appointment scheduled with him for December 15th to begin divorce proceedings, but Richard's heart attack on November 27th had preempted that timeline. "Then these documents might still be useful," Attorney Morrison had suggested. "Not for divorce, obviously, but potentially for a civil suit against Jessica for alienation of affection or for recovering the financial damages your husband caused through his affair." The suggestion surprised me. I hadn't considered that Richard's betrayal might have legal remedies beyond divorce, that Jessica's role in the affair might carry consequences beyond moral judgment. The possibility of suing Jessica for alienation of affection occupied my thoughts through the dark days of early January, when the reality of Richard's death settled in, alongside the reality of his betrayal, and I had to process both simultaneously while managing his estate and dealing with the social fallout of his funeral confession. Michigan didn't recognize alienation of affection as a legal claim, Attorney Morrison had clarified after researching the question, which meant I couldn't sue Jessica for destroying my marriage, even though Richard's letter had publicly confirmed her role in doing exactly that. But there were other legal options, potentially suing her for the share of joint funds Richard had spent on their affair, claiming she'd benefited from marital assets without my consent. It would be difficult to prove and even harder to collect, Attorney Morrison had warned. You'd need to document specific gifts or transfers, prove Jessica knew the money came from joint marital funds, and then convince a judge that she should repay funds your husband gave her voluntarily. Courts are generally reluctant to intervene in these situations unless there's clear fraud or theft, and what you're describing is more complicated than that. So pursuing Jessica legally would be expensive, time-consuming, uncertain, and would require me to relitigate Richard's affair publicly in ways that might hurt Marcus more than punish Jessica. I'd spent 6 months gathering evidence for a confrontation I'd never gotten, and now the evidence sat in folders in my closet, meticulously organized proof of betrayal that had no clear legal purpose but somehow felt important to preserve. Maybe someday I'd show it to Marcus, let him see the full scope of what Jessica and Richard had done. Maybe someday I'd use it in some way I hadn't imagined yet. But for now, it remained archived, a testament to 6 months of performance and documentation that had led to a funeral revelation I'd never planned, but couldn't bring myself to regret. Marcus filed for divorce from Jessica in mid-January, citing irreconcilable differences, but making it clear to everyone who asked that the differences were his wife's 15-month affair with his father, revealed publicly at said father's funeral in a confession that left no room for alternative interpretations. Jessica had tried to call me 3 times in the weeks after the funeral, leaving messages that ranged from apologetic to defensive to angry, asking why I'd let Richard's letter be read, knowing what it would do to her reputation and her marriage. I'd never returned the calls, had no interest in hearing her justifications or explanations or attempts to minimize what she'd done. Richard's letter had said everything that needed saying about the affair, that it lasted 15 months, that it was wrong, that I'd known and stayed silent, that they'd both betrayed Marcus in ways that couldn't be undone or excused. What more was there to discuss? Jessica's marriage was ending, her reputation in our community was destroyed, and she'd have to live with the consequences of choices she'd made freely and repeatedly over more than a year. I'd spent 6 months pretending I didn't know about those choices while documenting them methodically. And now the documentation and the performance had served their purpose by letting Richard's own words deliver the judgment I'd been planning. Whether Jessica thought that judgment was fair or excessive or cruelly public didn't particularly matter to me anymore. She'd had 15 months to consider consequences before Richard's death forced them into the open. Now she could live with them the same way I was living with the consequences of having been betrayed by both my husband and my daughter-in-law, while maintaining silence until the moment of maximum impact. Justice wasn't always pretty or comfortable, but it was still justice. Sarah, my daughter who lived in Ohio with her husband Tom, called in late January after weeks of processing the funeral revelation and its aftermath from a distance that had spared her the immediate chaos, but not the eventual knowledge that her father had been unfaithful and her sister-in-law had been complicit. "Mom, I need to ask you something," she'd said, her voice careful in the way that meant she'd been thinking about this conversation for a while. "Did you know what Dad's letter said before you had it read at the funeral?" The question was reasonable and inevitable, and I'd decided weeks ago that I'd answer it honestly if Sarah asked directly. "No," I told her. "I suspected it might contain a confession based on things your father had said about writing something honest about his mistakes, but I didn't read it before the funeral. I chose to honor his wishes that it be read publicly without preview." That was technically true. I'd never opened the envelope, never read the letter privately, but it was also incomplete because I'd known about the affair, had suspected the letter might reference it, and had deliberately not read it specifically so I could maintain plausible deniability about weaponizing Richard's own words at his funeral. "But you knew about the affair," Sarah pressed. "Dad's letter said you knew. For how long?" And so I'd explained again, giving Sarah the same narrative I'd given Marcus about the Riverside Motel and the 6 months of documentation and the strategy of staying silent until I was ready to confront it. "That's so calculating, Mom," Sarah had said when I finished, and I couldn't tell if she meant it as criticism or observation. "I know," I'd agreed. "But your father was calculating too, planning an affair that required coordination and deception across 15 months. I just matched his energy." Sarah had been quiet for a moment before saying something I hadn't expected. "I'm proud of you. I wish you hadn't had to do it. Wish Dad had been better, and Jessica had been better. But since they weren't, I'm proud you protected yourself instead of just accepting it." The validation from my daughter mattered more than I'd anticipated. Confirmation that my 6-month performance hadn't been crazy or excessive, but necessary and smart given the circumstances I'd been navigating alone. Eleanor and I were sorting through Richard's belongings in March when we found his personal journal, a leather-bound book I'd never seen before that had been hidden in the back of his closet behind old medical textbooks and boxes of dental supplies he'd apparently been hoarding. The journal covered 3 years, starting well before the affair with Jessica began, and reading it felt like violating privacy I'd probably lost the right to respect after 6 months of documenting his betrayal. But Eleanor had insisted we look, arguing that Richard had forfeited his privacy rights when he'd chosen to conduct an affair and then confess it publicly, and the journal entries about Jessica were devastating in their casual cruelty. "Started spending more time with Jay," one entry from 16 months ago read. "She's easy to talk to, understands professional frustration in ways H doesn't anymore. Makes me feel younger, more vital, like I'm not just the aging dentist and father but still someone interesting and desirable." The rationalization was familiar. Middle-aged man flattering himself that attention from a younger woman meant something profound rather than just being attention from a younger woman. Later entries documented the progression from emotional affair to physical affair, from coffee meetings to motel rooms, From guilty conscience to normalized deception. H suspects nothing, Richard had written 4 months ago. I'm more careful now, better at managing the logistics. J and I have schedules and codes. It's sustainable as long as we're smart about it. The assumption that I suspected nothing was particularly galling, given that I'd been documenting his affair meticulously during the exact period he'd written that entry. But it confirmed that my performance had been convincing enough to fool him completely. The journal entries stopped 3 weeks before his death, the final entry noting chest pains he'd been having but dismissing them as stress. Need to manage stress better, he'd written. Maybe end things with J, refocus on marriage. But not yet. Not while it's still this good. Richard had been planning to continue the affair indefinitely, or at least until it became inconvenient to maintain, and his death had interrupted those plans the same way it had interrupted my divorce plans. Reading his journal felt like finding evidence after the trial was over, proof that validated everything I'd suspected, but that came too late to affect outcomes. The symbolic resolution of Richard's final letter occurred in June, 6 months after his funeral revelation, when I finally opened the safe deposit box at our bank that Richard had maintained separately from our joint accounts. Attorney Morrison had found the key in Richard's desk during estate processing, and accessing the box required court authorization since it was in Richard's name alone, but eventually I'd gotten permission to inventory its contents. Inside were documents I'd expected: birth certificates, old tax returns, the deed to a small property Richard's father had left him that had been sold years ago. But also 2 things I hadn't expected. First was a second copy of his final letter, identical to the one that had been read at his funeral, except for a handwritten note at the bottom. Helen, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've heard the letter read publicly. I know that public confession isn't the private apology you deserved, but I was too cowardly to give you that apology while alive. Please know that I loved you even while betraying you, and I'm sorrier than these inadequate words can express. The other envelope contained something that might help. The other envelope held a detailed accounting of every dollar Richard had spent on the affair: restaurants, hotels, gifts, cash withdrawals, totaling $29,743 over 15 months, matching my own documentation almost perfectly. At the bottom of his accounting was a note: money taken from joint accounts without your knowledge or consent. Jessica received approximately $18,000 in gifts and experiences. Remaining $11,000 went to operational costs. Suggest you pursue recovery from J if desired. Full documentation attached. Richard had apparently been documenting his own affair with the same meticulous attention I'd been bringing to documenting evidence of his affair, and he'd left me the receipts as either apology or ammunition, or possibly both. The gesture was simultaneously thoughtful and infuriating, Richard giving me tools to pursue Jessica legally while being safely dead and unable to face consequences himself. But it confirmed that the $30,000 I'd calculated had been accurate, and it gave me ironclad evidence of financial damages if I chose to pursue them. The decision of whether to pursue legal action against Jessica occupied me through the summer months, weighing the satisfaction of holding her financially accountable against the cost of relitigating everything publicly and potentially hurting Marcus further by keeping the affair in public conversation. Attorney Morrison had been clear that Richard's documentation made a civil case possible, that I could reasonably argue Jessica had been unjustly enriched by $18,000 of gifts purchased with marital funds, and that a judge might order repayment. But you need to consider whether recovering that money is worth the cost in time, legal fees, and emotional energy, he'd advised. You'd be spending probably $5,000 in legal costs to potentially recover $18,000, assuming the court ruled in your favor and Jessica actually paid the judgment. And you'd be keeping this affair public for however long the case took, which could be months or years, depending on how Jessica defended herself. Eleanor thought I should sue, arguing that Jessica deserved every consequence I could legally impose, and that letting her escape financial accountability sent the wrong message. But Marcus, when I'd asked his opinion during one of our increasingly regular dinners together, had been less certain. "Do what you need to do, Mom," he'd said. "But for me personally, I'd like to stop thinking about Dad's affair and Jessica's betrayal and just move forward. The divorce is almost final. She's moving to another state, and I'm trying to rebuild. If you need to pursue her legally to feel justice was done, I understand. But if you're doing it for me, don't. I've had enough exposure." His perspective mattered more than Eleanor's because Marcus was the one who'd been most hurt by the affair beyond me. And if he wanted to move forward rather than continue fighting, I could respect that. So I'd made my decision. I wouldn't sue Jessica for the money Richard had spent on her, wouldn't relitigate the affair in civil court, wouldn't pursue financial justice beyond the moral judgment Richard's funeral confession had already delivered. But I'd keep the documentation, Richard's and mine both, archived and organized in case circumstances changed, or I changed my mind, or someday there was a reason to use evidence I'd spent 6 months gathering for a confrontation that had ultimately taken a completely different form than I'd planned. The 1-year anniversary of discovering Richard's affair at the Riverside Motel arrived in May, and I marked it privately by driving past that motel for the first time since the initial discovery, seeing Space 17 empty and the building looking even more run down than I'd remembered. 12 months had passed since the afternoon I'd seen Richard's car and Jessica's car and made the decision to stay silent while gathering evidence. 12 months that had included 6 months of performance and documentation and 6 months of aftermath following Richard's death and funeral revelation. Looking back, I could trace a direct line from that moment in the parking lot to every decision that had followed. Installing financial monitoring software on our computers, following Richard to restaurants and meetings, documenting every suspicious charge and timeline inconsistency, building a case for confrontation that I'd never gotten to deliver because heart disease had intervened before I could file for divorce. But Richard's final letter had delivered the confrontation for me, his own words exposing what I'd discovered and validating my choice to stay silent rather than react immediately. The funeral had been exactly 6 months after my discovery, and the public revelation had been more devastating to Jessica's reputation and Richard's legacy than any private confrontation could have achieved. Marcus's divorce was finalized now. Jessica had moved to Arizona to escape the social judgment of our community, and Richard's dental practice had been sold to his partner with proceeds that made me financially secure for the rest of my life. The affair had cost Richard his marriage, his reputation, and eventually his life when stress and guilt and the physical demands of maintaining deception had contributed to the heart disease that killed him. Whether that constituted justice or just tragedy, I'd probably spend the rest of my life trying to determine. The blog post I wrote about my experience appeared in September on a website for women navigating betrayal and divorce, shared anonymously but based entirely on true events from the Riverside Motel discovery through Richard's funeral confession. I spent 6 months pretending I didn't know my husband was having an affair, it began. I documented everything, planned my confrontation meticulously, and was preparing to file for divorce when he died suddenly. His final letter, read at his funeral to 200 people, confessed the affair publicly and acknowledged that I'd known and stayed silent. This is the story of why I chose silence over immediate confrontation, what I learned during those 6 months of performance, and whether the strategy was worth the emotional cost. The post went viral in the niche community that read such things, generating hundreds of comments from women who'd faced similar betrayals and made different choices, some confronting immediately, some divorcing quietly, some staying in marriages after affairs ended. Reading their stories made me realize my experience wasn't unique, even if the specific details were, that the calculus of whether to confront betrayal immediately or strategically was one that thousands of women navigated with varying degrees of success. "Your husband gave you the confrontation you'd been denied," one commenter wrote. His confession at his own funeral was the universe's way of delivering justice when death prevented you from delivering it yourself. Maybe that was true. Maybe Richard's letter had been his final act of accountability, or his attempt at redemption, or just his need to confess, documented in a way that would survive his death. Whatever his motivation, the letter had achieved what my 6 months of documentation had prepared for: public exposure of betrayal that left no room for denial or minimization or shared blame. And that exposure had been enough, or at least had to be enough, because it was all I was going to get. The coffee meeting with Jessica happened in November, 18 months after I'd discovered the affair, and almost a year after Richard's funeral, at her request through an intermediary because I'd been ignoring her direct attempts at communication. She was back in town briefly to finalize some remaining divorce paperwork with Marcus, and she'd asked Eleanor to ask me if I'd be willing to meet for 30 minutes of conversation that she said she needed for closure. My first instinct had been to refuse. What closure could there possibly be after Richard's public confession and all its consequences? But Eleanor had encouraged me to hear her out, arguing that facing Jessica directly might provide the confrontation I'd been denied when Richard died, before I could divorce him. So I'd agreed to meet at a neutral coffee shop at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, deliberately choosing the time and day that had once been their affair schedule, a petty gesture that gave me small satisfaction. Jessica looked thinner than I remembered, tired in a way that suggested the past year had been as difficult for her as it had been for me, and she'd started talking almost before she'd sat down. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she said. "I know what I did was unforgivable, but I need you to understand that it wasn't about hurting you or Marcus. Richard and we just connected in a way that felt inevitable, and by the time I realized how wrong it was, I was already in too deep to extract myself without destroying everything." The explanation was familiar, the kind of rationalization that affairs always generated, and I'd listened without interrupting while she'd worked through her narrative of how the affair had started innocently and progressed inadvertently, and how she'd never meant for anyone to get hurt. When she'd finally stopped talking, I'd sat in silence for a long moment before responding. "You're right that I won't forgive you," I'd told Jessica, watching her face for reactions that would tell me if this conversation was genuine remorse or image management. "You and Richard didn't just connect inevitably. You both made dozens of conscious choices over 15 months to continue deceiving me and Marcus. Every time you came to our house for dinner and hugged me and called me Mom, that was a choice. Every time you sat across from Marcus pretending everything was fine while planning your next meeting with his father, that was a choice. Richard's dead, so he can't be held accountable except through the reputation damage his letter caused. But you're alive, and you made those same choices he did, and I'm not required to understand or forgive them just because you've decided you need closure." Jessica had flinched at the harshness of my tone, but I'd continued before she could interrupt. "You asked through Eleanor if I'd known what Richard's letter said before I had it read at his funeral. The answer is no. I never read it privately. But I'd known about your affair for 6 months before Richard died, had documented everything, and was planning to confront both of you in divorce court before his heart attack preempted that timeline. So while I didn't know his letter would expose the affair publicly, I'd been planning my own exposure, and I'm not sorry his letter beat me to it. You wanted the affair to stay hidden because exposure was inconvenient and embarrassing. Richard gave you exposure instead, and you've spent a year dealing with consequences you'd both been avoiding. That feels like justice to me, even if it's not the justice I'd originally planned." Jessica had left shortly after that, our 30-minute closure conversation lasting exactly 14 minutes, and I'd watched her walk to her car with the knowledge that this was probably the last time we'd ever speak. The confrontation I'd waited 18 months for hadn't been cathartic exactly, hadn't made me feel better or more resolved or less angry about what they'd done. But it had been necessary, a final accounting where Jessica had to face someone she'd wronged and hear that her explanations and rationalizations didn't erase the harm she'd caused. That was enough. That had to be enough. The second anniversary of Richard's death arrived in November with less fanfare than the first. Just a quiet acknowledgement from Marcus and Sarah and Eleanor that 2 years had passed since the heart attack that had killed him and the funeral that had exposed his affair and changed all of our relationships permanently. I'd visited Richard's grave once since the burial, on the 1-year anniversary, and had stood looking at his headstone trying to feel something other than anger and residual betrayal. The inscription was simple: Richard Morrison, beloved husband and father, 1955-2022. And notably didn't mention anything about being faithful or honest or trustworthy, because those weren't words that applied anymore, regardless of what 30 of our 32 years together had been like. The last 2 years had been defined by his betrayal, and my response to it, by the 6 months I'd spent performing ignorance while gathering evidence, and the 1.5 years since his death that I'd spent processing both grief and anger in complicated tangles I wasn't sure I'd ever fully separate. People asked me sometimes if I missed Richard, if I'd forgiven him posthumously, if the passage of time had softened my feelings about what he'd done. The answers were complicated. I missed the Richard I'd thought I was married to for 30 years. The man who'd been genuine before becoming the man who'd have an affair with his daughter-in-law. I didn't miss the Richard who'd made those choices, who'd betrayed me and Marcus, who'd spent $30,000 of our money on deception. As for forgiveness, I'd gotten as close as I probably would when I'd decided not to sue Jessica for financial recovery, when I'd chosen to let Richard's funeral confession be the extent of public exposure rather than pursuing further legal action. That felt like mercy, if not quite forgiveness, and it was probably all Richard's memory deserved. The estate was finally settled in December, 2 years and 1 month after Richard's death, with all debts paid and assets distributed according to his will that had left everything to me, with secondary bequests to Marcus and Sarah. The final accounting showed Richard's estate had been worth approximately $1.2 million after subtracting debts, including the house worth $600,000, retirement accounts totaling $400,000, life insurance of $350,000, and various other assets that added up to the remaining amount. I'd split half of it with Marcus and Sarah immediately, giving them each $300,000 as early inheritance because they'd both been hurt by Richard's choices and they deserved something positive from his death beyond just the life insurance policy he'd maintained. Marcus had used his share to buy a new house and start over in a life that didn't contain Jessica or reminders of his father's betrayal. Sarah had put hers toward her children's college funds and some long-delayed home renovations. And I'd kept my half $600,000 that would fund a retirement I'd never planned to spend alone, but that now stretched ahead of me. In solitary years, I'd have to figure out how to fill. The money was useful, but insufficient compensation for 32 years of marriage that had been revealed as 30 years of genuine partnership, plus 2 years of betrayal I'd been too trusting to notice earlier. But insufficient compensation was all I was getting, so I'd learned to accept it the same way I'd learned to accept that Richard's final letter had delivered the confrontation I'd been planning and denied me in equal measure. Justice was imperfect, closure was incomplete, and the evidence I'd gathered during 6 months of silent performance now sat archived in my closet as proof of betrayal that would never be fully addressed or resolved because death had removed half the guilty parties before accountability could be fully extracted. The symbolic final moment came in January, 3 years and 2 months after I'd discovered the affair, when I finally threw away the file folders containing all my documentation, the spreadsheets and bank statements and photographs and timelines that had consumed 6 months of my life and had served their purpose when Richard's letter had exposed the affair publicly. Eleanor had argued I should keep them indefinitely as insurance against some unnamed future need, but I'd decided that holding on to evidence of betrayal indefinitely was like keeping wounds deliberately open rather than letting them scar over. The folders were 3 years old now, documenting transactions and patterns that were no longer relevant to my life or Richard's non-existent estate. So I'd fed them into the shredder 1 page at a time, watching my meticulous documentation turn into confetti that couldn't be reconstructed or used or referenced, destroying the evidence while keeping the memories and lessons that really mattered. I'd learned during those 6 months of performance that I was capable of strategic thinking and disciplined deception when necessary, that I could maintain composure under circumstances that should have broken me. That silence could be more powerful than confrontation if deployed correctly. Those lessons had value beyond the specific situation that taught them, were applicable to future challenges I'd inevitably face in the remaining decades of my life. But the specific evidence of Richard's specific betrayal didn't need to be preserved indefinitely, didn't need to occupy mental or physical space in my life 3 years after the fact. So I destroyed it, page by page, converting documentation into trash, and when I'd finished shredding the last spreadsheet, I'd felt something release that had been held tight for 3 years. The affair was over, Richard was dead, Jessica was living in Arizona, Marcus was rebuilding his life, and I was learning to build a life that didn't revolve around betrayal and evidence and the performance I'd maintained for 6 months. That felt like progress, or at least like the closest thing to progress I was likely to achieve. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey from the Riverside Motel parking lot, through Richard's death and funeral revelation, and the aftermath that stretched across 3 years, thank you for witnessing a story about betrayal and strategy and the complicated math of when to confront harm versus when to document it for future confrontation. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who faced impossible choices and made imperfect decisions that nonetheless led to some form of justice, about marriages that ended through death rather than divorce, but that still required accounting and closure, about the specific way that staying silent can sometimes be more powerful than immediate confrontation. Comment with your city or state if you've ever discovered betrayal and had to decide between reacting immediately or waiting strategically, because that decision is one of the hardest parts of surviving infidelity, and there's no universal right answer. My answer was to perform ignorance for 6 months while gathering evidence for a confrontation that never happened because Richard died before I could file for divorce. But his final letter delivered the exposure I'd been planning anyway, revealing everything to 200 people at his funeral and giving me the justice I'd been denied by his death. Whether that was enough justice, whether I made the right choice to stay silent instead of confronting him immediately, whether the evidence I gathered served any real purpose beyond my own need for control and documentation, those are questions I'll probably spend the rest of my life answering differently, depending on my mood and perspective. But I know I protected myself financially, maintained my dignity throughout, and ensured that Richard's betrayal was publicly exposed rather than privately hidden. And those outcomes feel like success, even if the emotional cost was higher than I'd anticipated when I'd first made the decision to say nothing while documenting everything.